Welcome to my talk about going from legacy to Symfony. I don't know if you have read my abstract, but I put the following question inside. How one can use Symfony 4.0 and PHP 7.2 while working with a legacy application. And as you may know, as a matter of fact, none of these is released yet. So basically, this talk is about how to work with the latest Symfony version and the latest PHP version in general, how to get there. My name is Sebastian, and I currently work at Showroom, which is an e-commerce online marketplace for fashion. So you might have not heard about it because it's more a women thing, and not many women here. I can't see any. And I've previously worked at a company called GoldenLine, which is a business social network. I'm also honored to be a certified Symfony developer, and I make a living with PHP for over 15 years already. So I will use both of these companies as real-life examples, and I will show real-life code and real-life approaches to the topic of the talk. So let's start with GoldenLine, with one of those companies. So GoldenLine was founded in 2005, so 12 years ago. And for the sake of simplicity, let's call it the Polish LinkedIn. So it is an employment-oriented service. It has over 2 million registered users, and the main features are job offers and user profiles, which you can browse. And it used to be one of the most popular websites in Poland, so from a traffic perspective. It was built back then in 2005 on an in-house framework called Explode. It's an internal name. This framework was never published, so you can't reach it on the internet. And it was inspired by the few PHP frameworks that were available back then, but there were not so many. I think Symfony 1 was already there, but it wasn't a good framework back then, I think. Fabian would have admitted so. So it was inspired by these frameworks, but was custom built. And it was basically a LAMP stack, so Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. Some parts were, of course, exchanged later for Nginx, for example, but it's a kind of a traditional PHP app, and it was a monolith, so a single application. This is how GoldenLine looks like today. So this is a view of the job listings on the website. But before we got there, we struggled with some issues, and I want to talk about them today. So one of the main issues with an in-house framework is that onboarding of new developers takes time. For us, it was almost 6 months. So when we hired somebody, it was a PHP developer, of course, but before the person could do things on his own, it took almost 6 months to learn not only the business model, which is, of course, unique in every company, but also the technology part. So this was a big issue for us. I think the reason behind this was the lack of documentation. So the framework was not documented. And if you wanted to make a controller, you had to dig into the code, look how controllers were built in the framework, and do copy-pasting, changing, and this kind of stuff. And if you wanted to access a database, the same. So you could ask a colleague, but most of the time you had to play around it, and it took a lot of time. It wasn't also tested, so there were no tests, no unit tests, no tests at all. So if you wanted to change a single piece of code, and it was quite complex, probably you would break another piece of the software. So that was also the reason why we didn't allow newcomers to push to production very soon. So maybe before the 6 months period, but not in a week or something. And I've also mentioned already complexity. So it was, the code base was huge because it has a lot of features. It was quite a big website. It has this job offers, a search engine, user profiles, A lot of stuff. So I don't know, I don't have exact numbers about the lines of codes or the files, but it was, checking it out was about 500 megabytes of code. So it was a lot. There were, of course, graphics inside, so it's not like only PHP, but it took some time. So everything was tightly coupled, complex, untestable, not documented, and so on. So the first idea everybody is thinking about is throw this stuff away and rewrite it from scratch. But you should know that this is the worst single idea you could make, a decision you can make, and it's a quote from Joel Spolsky from Stack Overflow. Because that would mean that you will be feature freeze for a long period of time. And with, we did some estimations on when we thought this way, and it took us 2 years to rewrite the code base. So it wasn't acceptable from the business perspective. And for me personally, it was also like I was not convinced that after the 2-year period, you would have been in a better place. Because you're not sure what you are rewriting. When you are rewriting crap, it will still be crap. So in 2012, this was a milestone for PHP as a whole because Composer came out. Before that, I don't know how long you are coding, but before that, it was on a daily basis that most libraries lived inside the repo. And this was the case in GoldenLine. We had PHP Mailer inside, Smarty template engine inside in the repo. That's why the repo was so big. So Composer came out, and we started immediately using it because it was a great improvement for PHP. And we were waiting for it for a long time. And we started to use some libraries, the first library, the second library, and then we used also like a Symfony component, which was the console. It was our first component that we used. And then we started to think, wow, it's super easy to get a new component. And we wanted to use all the components out there for, at that time. Request response, the HTTP foundation, even dispatcher, dependency injection, all this was missing in our framework, and we wanted just to have it. And introducing it one by one would take, the 2 years probably. But we wanted it all, and we wanted it now. So we decided to migrate to Symfony. And by Symfony, I mean the standard edition, the whole stack. But how can we do that? So we had a proof of concept, and it was accepted by the management. So if you want to make a tough decision, like a shift, a technical shift, we have to prove that this will work. So our first approach was to use the Symfony standard edition, pull it into our code base, combine the two applications basically, and use the Symfony application only to get the requests and respond with a response, but the logic has to be served by the legacy application because we don't want it to rewrite anything. So we did it, and it worked out. So it was like a month of work to prepare. It was a small team of 2 people. The others were working on ongoing features because we don't want a feature freeze. And we were able to push all requests coming from our users through the Symfony application. And we have encapsulated the legacy application with the opstarts thing. You can just grab the response and send it back to the user. And it turned out to work, and it also worked on production. So it was a big milestone for us, and a good point that we can go further. So we did. And the motivation with going further was to be able to serve something from Symfony exclusively. So we don't use the legacy application. So our scenario was to be able to be a user, and I'm the green one here, for example, and I go to Symfony and get a response directly from Symfony, and I'm not touching the X. The X is our legacy application explode. And, but still, this is only a proof of concept, so our users shouldn't be affected. And this is our example user. which should be able to still go through Symfony to the old framework. So we did a custom annotation, which is stated at the topic. At the top, it's a legacy if role not annotation. But we first had to convert our routing to Symfony so we can handle this request internally in Symfony. So hopefully our routing was a big PHP array. I've deleted some keys to make it more readable, but basically it was a regular expression which hopefully matches the way the Symfony router works because it also accepts regular expressions. So we were able to create a Symfony root object, pass the parameter inside, and set it as a requirement, and then create a collection out of it. So this is our custom code for this operation. You can see there's also like methods being passed or SSL requirements, all the stuff you can set on the root, which are kind of optional. When you don't set the method, you serve all get, post, and so on. I will cover this later. And the tricky part was the custom controller, which we already had from the previous proof of concept, which was only encapsulating the legacy application, so with the opt-out and so on. So basically, mapping this allowed us to build a single action in Symfony and put the annotation in the comment section. And here's the role Symfony that was assigned to all our stuff at the company, this role. You had to be logged in, of course. And if you had the role, you could have reached a pure Symfony controller. And if not, the execution would stop on parsing the annotations and would fall back to the legacy application. And again, it worked. And the concept of this you might also know as feature flags, because it's kind of the same concept. We have to use it later also for rewriting things in place and shipping new stuff to production, testing it ourselves, and then just switching all the users or a couple of users to the new feature, which was very helpful with getting from legacy code to Symfony code and making sure we are not breaking anything, and also releasing to production on a daily basis. So we had, in the meantime, a project which was a redesign of the website, and we wanted to use Boostrap for this because we wanted all the HTML5 goodies and CSS3 and so on. But it was 2012, and if you remember, Internet Explorer was still a thing. It's not anymore, so hopefully. But we had to deal with it, but it wasn't, the percentage was quite low. So we had a couple of customers, they were paying customers, so we had internal tools for them. So we had to still support the old layout. But for the vast majority of users, we wanted to give a new layout. Don't have to wait that Internet Explorer will die. So what we did, we made another annotation, which is simple. You can write it in 5 minutes. It's called legacy if old browser. And how it works is when you come in with a modern browser, for example, Chrome, you will reach the Symfony application which is serving you the new layout. And the Symfony application only knew about the new layout because it has all the styles, all the trick templates. And if you visit our website with an old browser like Internet Explorer, you would be passed to the legacy application. This, of course, meant that we had to be able to have 2 copies of the same website. This was used first on the user profile, so we had an old profile and a new profile. But the differences were not so big from the data perspective. It was just a layout, so it worked out. And later on, we could have dropped Internet Explorer completely. But for some time, we had this fix on production. And it was a good fix because we had the opportunity to serve the load traffic from our paying customers still on these legacy browsers because they couldn't upgrade because of like cooperation regulations and so on. You could use it like the earlier one. You could also mix them. So here you have to be on a modern browser and have the raw Symfony, for example. And with this in place, we started rewriting almost everything. Not rewriting, but if we were working on some piece of the website, the philosophy was to always do it the new way. So if it wasn't like a lot more work to do, we went with the new approach. But sometimes we just wanted to change, for example, form handling without rewriting the form. So another concept of we wanted to get the form with a legacy code, for example, the get, and to handle the form submission with Symfony. And at the previous slides, you might have seen the set method requirement. So this was it. We just added a get requirement for the legacy application routing and the post for the new one. And there were two separate routes handled correctly. But if you do so, you ran into an issue with validation because the Symfony form out of the box won't let you in. And the reason is CSRF, because it's cross-site request forgery. It's a simple token that is placed in the form itself. It's mostly a hidden field calculated somehow in the session or on a hash or something. And these, there were two different applications, and the code was different, so it didn't work out. So we wrote a custom CSRF provider, which was compatible with the old application. And you then can just use it on your form. Just ship it with the default options, and it will work. So my first slide with the issues we had was the following, and it was after some time no longer the case. So the first, I think the biggest difference was developers were able to push to production on the very first day because we no longer needed to recruit just PHP developers, but Symfony developers. So when they saw the code base, they felt like at home. So they were able to push code to production very soon. The documentation issue was also not an issue anymore, covering the technical perspective, because we could just link to the awesome Symfony documentation. And if somebody got a question, you just put a link instead of explaining why this old approach is, how to do it in the old approach. And you have also the community, so you can search for questions. How do you deal with this and that? And a lot of stuff you can't have with an in-house framework. Testing was also a lot easier because of this decoupling which is going on in Symfony. So you can test the service with unit test and make a web test case. So all new code was tested, and it was also easier and possible because it wasn't possible at the beginning. And the complexity has also gone away because while we were writing part of the applications, we have put them into separate bundles which were decoupled. I know bundles are not the best practice anymore, but back then they were. But still you could, if you were touching user base, you'd go into user bundle. If you had to change something for job offers, you go into job offers bundle and so on. So it was quite a lot better, a better experience after all. And as a matter of fact, a year after, we were at the Symfony conference in Warsaw, and we were awarded the best Symfony website and the best social website. And I think no other company took two of these awards. So I think this worked out well. So another example, Showroom. Showroom looks like this. today, and it looks like this a year ago also, because I will be covering this. Showroom is an online marketplace for fashion. It was founded in 2012, and it is built primarily on the Slim micro framework and Falcon. And it's an API-centric application, which means that we have a core API, which is an internal API, but so not available for the public. But we have a single piece that is connected to the database. Then we have a separate application for worker processes, for the storefront, for the back office. So these are all separate applications, but they are mainly based on the two frameworks I've mentioned. So the issues with Showroom were that we were locked on Falcon 2, and so we were also on PHP 5.6 because, as you may know, Falcon is shipped as a C extension. You have to install it on the web server, and if you don't use the latest version, you have to compile from source because nobody has the latest version in the repo anymore. So you have to compile from source on production locally, so it's getting bad. And version 2 also doesn't compile on PHP 7.1, so we were locked on that. Again, for the Slim and Falcon are common frameworks, and they have documentation, but they are so tiny that most of the code you write is still custom. So even if we have frameworks, I will call it still an in-house solution because there was a custom solution to access the database, to do templating, to do all this stuff. And this was not documented. Again, tests were like, we had no tests. And as a matter of fact, all the developers who were joining the company got frustrated because every time you wanted to do something, you had to dig into the code, and it was even worse than at GoldenLine, I think, because accessing the database with locking or some crazy stuff was a magic flag with underscore something, and you have to look it out into the code. It was horrible. So we made another approach in 2016 when I joined the company. So we just made a second version of the API. So a new project side by side. It was based on Symfony 3. And we made it for the core API, and we also made it for the front end. Just a single application. So a separate application living side by side with the old one. To integrate the application, especially the storefront and others that will come later, with the new approach, we have also created an SDK for internal use. So when we add something to our API, we add methods to the SDK, which we can then use in this application, and you don't have to know which the endpoint is. The benefit of this approach I will show you later. So first, let me start with the stack. This is the stack before we did the change. So going through it, we had an Nginx at the front, which is doing SSL termination, access logging, and redirecting from HTTP to HTTPS. Basically this. We support only HTTPS traffic being in e-commerce. Then on the second layer, Nginx can only talk to Varnish on the standard port. Varnish is doing HTTP cache. It's our load balancer. Nginx can do this also, but Varnish has more features, has great health checks. And is also doing at-site includes, I will cover later. Then we have again an Nginx server, which is just there to talk to PHP. So it is talking to FPM and doing vhosts to be able to host multiple applications on the same server. And so we had application-specific access logs, so you don't have to filter the big access log, just to filter the small one. And underneath was PHP 5.6 back then with FPM and all the services that are needed with Postgres being the main database. So building two new applications on Symfony 3 and PHP 7, we had to host them. So we added a second vhost on a different port, but it's the same Nginx instance. And we added an FPM instance with PHP 7.1. And how to actually make this work? So we use Varnish for this because it has a language, configuration language you can do if, else, and these kind of stuff in, which is kind of tricky in Nginx and other servers. So imagine you have 3 servers which are hosting all your applications, and you want to be able to run 2 versions of your application at a time. I think the 2 versions at a time is kind of constant. You don't want to have 3 versions of your application at one time, but the servers, of course, can be hundreds if you want to, but they wouldn't fit on a slide. So you have to configure them in Varnish. They're called backends, and it's simply a name, a port, a name, an IP, and a port. On the left-hand side, we have different IPs and the same port, which is PHP 5.6. And on the right-hand side, we have the same IPs as on the left side, but a different port. This gives us 6 servers. Then we group them into which is called a director in Varnish. So we make a director of version 1 and put all the version 1 servers in, and version 2 and pull all the version 2 servers in, which are listening to on a different port. And on the Nginx side, probably you're not doing the DevOps stuff, but it's quite a basic stuff. You can do it on your own. Don't be afraid of it. So this is the first server, which is hosting the legacy application, the API v1, for example, on the standard port. And the domain is, for example, here the API. And we have the PHP port 5.6. We used to name the ports exact like the PHP version, just to make sure it is the right version. And the only difference in this new configuration is the port, which has to be so you can host a different website on the same domain. And of course, then you can change the location of the project and pin it to another PHP version. And the magic happens in Varnish, and it's basically, I would say, 2 lines of code, but with the if statement, it's a bit more, but still a couple of lines. So with our core API, which again was internally used, so we knew which endpoint was in the new or old API handled, we used a custom header. So if our SDK or applications using that API would pass an application vendor showroom v2 JSON header, this notation is brought from GitHub, which has a similar approach for versioning, you would be served by the version 2. And a fallback was version 1. So we could just simply rewrite single endpoints in our core API, change the header notation in the SDK, and it worked out. So 1 endpoint at a time. But this doesn't work, of course, for web applications. You can't tell the user's browser, please send me a header if you are reaching this endpoint because it's new. So you have to do it for them. So for now, we don't have a lot of them. So we use a simple routing. And we apply, for example, these regular expressions to the routing. If it's profiler, because this config is also used on development machines, it's of course not available on production. We use assets, or we have rewritten the order refound endpoint. This would lead to being redirected to the Symfony 2 application, which was a standalone application without touching the old application. And the old one was still served, again, without the Symfony overhead. OK, I have a couple of things more, so I will just go through them. So one of the questions would be probably, how do you exchange the data if you have 2 APIs? We use Postgres as the main data store, as a database. And we allow each application, each PHP to connect to each service. So the PHP 5.6 can connect to Elasticsearch, Redis, Postgres, and Rabbit, and the 7.1 could also. So this requires some sort of regulations or some sort of rules you have to push yourself. First of all, we had a problem with, this is one of our legacy tables, which has a table name with square brackets. And it is not supported in Doctrine. You can't map a table name like this. So but we wanted to read the data in the new API. So we created a view with a different name. You can name it however you want. And this was mapped in Doctrine, where like it was telling it is an original table, but it was just a view. The other benefit of this approach is that you can change the field names, which also, if you have named them badly in the first place, you don't have to rename them. In the new API, you can just use proper names. So you don't have to keep that legacy with you. And one of the rules we have applied is that only one application can own the table, so only one application will write to it. So if it is a legacy table used in the legacy code, the legacy code is writing to it, so the new code can only read from it. And if we need something new in the new code, we add a table, and if we need that data in the legacy application, we add a view for it. But of course, the usage can differ in use case, and you can just mix them, but you have to be aware of caches and this kind of stuff if you do caches. I've mentioned earlier ESI. I don't have time to dig into it deeply, so it is built into Symfony, so I don't think it is the need to dig into it deeply, but ESI is a Varnish feature that allows you to serve a single element on the website with a sub request. So you probably know about sub requests internally. When you run tests, you can do sub requests in Symfony, for example, the forward and so on. But you can also do a real request, which is handled by Varnish. So the first page has a special markup which tells the URL of the snippet, and then it is pulled into the request, into the response to the user. And this gives us the opportunity to replace single pieces of the application, for example, the menu in this case. Okay, I will cover two last approaches to give you some time for questions. Microservices. I don't like the term, but it's catchy. When we were to build something new, we always thought, oh, we have to build it in the core API. But do we have to? So, for example, we had to make a shipping API, which is a logic for creating labels for UPS, DHL, and so on, storing that labels and these kind of stuff. And the core API don't have to know a lot about labels or how they are created. They just want to know there is a label and it has an ID. So we created, again, a separate application. We call it the shipping API. And in the place where we would, in the core API, use a server, so something PHP written in there, we just made HTTP call to that Symfony application. Again, we had an SDK for this, very simple SDK with, I think, one endpoint, only one method, because it was only like send, create label or something like this. But this allows us to have rules about the namings and value objects in PHP. So this is using HTTP, so it's synchronous. So you have to wait for the request, so it has kind of an overhead. The other approach we have lately used is an asynchronous way of doing this. And this, again, was we needed analytics features. We wanted to track if a user clicks a product, buys something, puts something into the cart, and so on. And the core API was only responsible for telling when that happened. And the events were then sent to a RabbitMQ. And the Symfony application that would take care of them was, again, a new application on the latest technology we can use, and pulled these events out. This is, if you can do this in this scenario, it's a lot better, because the analytics API, the analytics app could be down, could be broken and you still are not losing data, and the core is not broken at the same time. So this approach was also a good way of using the latest code without changing the legacy or changing it just a bit. So again, our main issues. We are still locked on Falcon and PHP 5.6, but only for the old ones we don't touch anymore. So at some point we will rewrite everything and just throw the old away. We have documentation covering how we should build a controller, how we should build a service, because it's a Symfony documentation. But we also use, for the API, Nelmi API doc, so we have also our internal documentation. Later, it will be also easier to change something in these applications, because it's also an overhead of having a lot of them. Testing is now done by default, so we are getting even more tests done. And splitting all these applications make it possible to test very fast, because each test takes about seconds, not minutes, because they are just simple, small applications. And the frustration has definitely go away. It's not uncommon that when we start a new project, a new Symfony application, that the devs tend to work after hours on weekends, because they are so excited about the new way we are doing this. So this is also a big win. Okay, thank you. And last but not least, please rate my talk on, if you have the latest iOS 11, you can, I don't know if you know, you can already scan QR codes. But even if not, you can go to the link. This talk will be also on the SymfonyCon in Romania, so I will really appreciate your feedback so I can improve the talk even to make it even better, and the recordings will be online. So thank you.